Welcome to the second season of Can I Get a Retake, the podcast where education gets innovative. I'm Michelle.
And I'm Michaela. Join us each month as we dive into the trends and technologies shaping the future of higher education.
Stay curious, stay inspired, and come learn with us from today's educators.
Real estate can be one of the most reliable forms of investment, an evergreen asset, if you will. Today, we learn how to master the real estate market and turn properties into profit. Our guest, Professor Mallory Meehan Esquire, is here to share her wealth of knowledge on navigating investments, tax breaks, and syndicate deals. Professor Meehan is an associate clinical professor of real estate and the assistant director of the Institute for Real Estate Studies at Penn State's Sneal College of Business. With a BS, MBA, and JD from Penn State, she blends academic rigor with hands-on expertise. A licensed attorney, realtor, and appraiser, Professor Meehan's background spans brokerage, property management, and investment. Join us as we learn practical tips to step into the real estate industry.
We always like to start at the beginning. Can you share your journey into both law and real estate and what led you to pursue your current career?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. It's a question I get often because not many people have the background that I have. So when I was deciding on colleges, I chose Penn State as to where I wanted to go. And I was kind of undecided initially as to what path I wanted to go. PR was always something that I really liked. So marketing, and I was always really into numbers. And so I came into Penn State undecided, and then I got into the business college. And so really started focusing in on business law, accounting, finance, really fell in love with that, and marketing. And so I got a degree in marketing and finance as my undergrad. And when I was graduating, it was the 2009, 2010 era. So it was right during the great financial recession. And, you know, a bunch of my classmates and other people were just struggling to find jobs and, you know, getting offers. And then the company would then, you know, renege on that offer because of the financial situations. And so I had done some hard thinking, and I was like, well, instead of stressing out about a job, why don't I just try to ride this out, stay in school, continue my education? And at that point, I really wanted to get an MBA. And in 2009, 2010, getting an MBA right out of undergrad was pretty much next to impossible. They didn't offer programs. They really wanted you to have work experience first and then come back to get a higher education degree. So I started looking into other alternatives, and I really did enjoy my business law class. And so the law part kind of really drew me in, and I found that there were a lot of law schools that offered joint degree programs. And so you would then be able to graduate with both a law degree and an MBA in the same kind of shortened time frame. And so I applied to a bunch of different law schools and ended up, you know, deciding to stay at Penn State. It was a place I didn't have to get reacquainted with. It was a place I was comfortable with. So making the transition into grad school, already a stressful situation, I wanted to take that burden off. So I stayed at Penn State, spent 2 years in the law school specifically. And then the third year I transitioned and spent an entire year in the business school, getting my MBA. And then the fourth year was a combination of finishing coursework between both the law school and the business school. And so I tell my students now I did the double tour. So I did 8 years at Penn State. And after that point, when I finished, I had to figure out, do I want to go the legal route? Do I want to go the business route? And so I kind of toyed with the idea. I took the bar, you know, I had the legal background, but something about the business was just really kind of pulling me tighter. And so I took a couple of different corporate jobs, trying to figure out what I wanted. I won't name the companies, but I ended up making a transition back to State College. My boyfriend, now husband, was still here. And so I found a job with a local real estate brokerage firm. And that's where my journey within real estate kind of became a thing. And so I was working with commercial entities, commercial properties, leasing, selling, really understanding property management and understanding that piece of it. But I wanted more. I wanted, further expansion. And as a small shop in central Pennsylvania, you're not going to have many opportunities to grow. And this was right around 2017, and Penn State was going through a retirement initiative. They were trying to get the older faculty out and get some young faculty in. And one of my former MBA professors was a department chair, and there were 2 openings in his department, one in business law and one in real estate. So I took the real estate opportunity, and here we are 8 years later. I have now been teaching real estate at Penn State in my alma mater, business college, and loving every minute of it. I love the students. I love interacting with them and being able to provide them constant up-to-date information on what real estate truly means.
So talk to us more about how you integrate a little bit more of your real world experience into teaching real estate. Like, what did you learn when you were practicing that you now have to impart on them?
Oh, absolutely. I love telling stories. So I pride myself in being a storyteller. And so anytime I had an experience in some sort of aspect, I incorporate that now into my teaching. And so one of the things that I do is I tell them a story about a bar that was being closed down and sold to another entity. And so this bar, the owner of the bar owned the business but didn't own the property. And so we had a good understanding of what assets are tied to the property and what assets are tied to the business. And this bar wanted to take the booths that were in the bar that had been there for years and years and years because they thought it was a business asset. And so I teach a lot about understanding personal property versus real property. And so especially if I have something that's here at in-state college in their backyard, they find it really cool to kind of put that together. So I like to tell them stories on, things like that. But now that I've become an active investor, I'll tell them the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so I feel like my job as an educator is to not only give them the skills that they need to be successful, but also prepare them for understanding it's not always going to be perfect. It's not always going to go the way that you plan. And every person you talk to is going to tell you about their horror stories. And so I'm going to tell you about my horror stories so that you don't have to go through them, but you'll know how to be better equipped. And so currently right now I'm investing in short-term rentals, long-term rentals. I do creative financing. So I educate my students on seller finance, buying property subject to an existing loan, lease options, ways for them to get into real estate that doesn't require that they save up 20% or more in order to have an asset underneath their name. So those are kind of some of the things that I've incorporated into my classes based on my own personal experience and my own personal portfolio.
Talking about creative financing, can you share an example of some kind of innovative strategy that you've used?
Yeah, so I think the one that I like to talk about the most, I have a property that's located in the Pittsburgh market. And with that property, the seller still wanted to retain the complete ownership and the tax benefits of owning it, but wanted to also sell at the same time. So you're like, you can't have your cake and eat it too. Like, we got to give or take. So what I did was I created a lease option with the seller. And so I have a lease that I pay the seller every month. And then I have an option that I can execute at an already predetermined price within a 3-year period. And so I took that lease option and then I created another lease option that I now have a tenant paying me rent, and they pay me more rent than what I pay the seller. So I have a cash flow in there. And then they had to pay me an option fee to give them the right to buy it in the future. And so I actually don't even physically own this property, but I'm making money on it month to month. I don't have to worry about the maintenance. I don't have to worry about the repairs. Now, the one caveat with that is I don't get the tax incentives. I don't get the tax benefits of the actual owner. But once it goes and sells, I also didn't have to pay the transfer taxes twice, which if you do buy property, you're now the owner. In the state of Pennsylvania, it's 1% of the purchase price both parties pay in transfer taxes at closing. And then if you go to sell, you're going to have to pay that 1% again. So with this lease option, I don't pay any of those transfer taxes whatsoever, but I still get the cash flow coming in, which is a way that people can get into real estate without needing to put themselves under an actual ownership liability situation and without needing to come up with 20% and get financing.
I'm going to have to email you later.
Right?
Because I have too
Listen,
many.
I love talking about this stuff. I love educating people, and that's part of what my mission is to help people learn how they can build wealth through real estate. And it doesn't require that you spend all your money saving up to move forward. Everybody has the opportunity to buy. It's just about being educated on your options. What a lot of people tell me, they're like, I don't want to be a landlord. I want passive income coming in. So how can I own real estate by still having passive? And there are a couple different options that you can do that. One of the options, like I told you, is a lease option. And I structure the leases similar to a commercial lease. And so if we're talking about the difference between a residential lease and a commercial lease, a lot of times residential leases say that the landlord has to take care of, the exterior of the property. They have to do the maintenance and, certain utilities. But on a commercial lease, a lot of times what we see is something called a triple net lease. And what a triple net lease means is that the commercial entity that is renting is responsible for everything. They're responsible for paying your property taxes. They're responsible for paying the insurance on the building, all of the maintenance, all of the upkeep, where essentially the landlord is just collecting a check. And so that's the model I turned into for this lease option. Anybody who wants to be my tenant, who wants to have the option to buy, I'm going to treat them as if they are the homeowner. I'm going to prepare them for home ownership, meaning they're going to be paying the property taxes. They're going to be paying the insurance. They're going to be taking care of maintenance issues. And so it's a way of treating them like the owner, getting them ready for home ownership, while also mitigating the risks that I have as the current landlord. If they want to be truly passive and let's say they do have money saved up and they're like, where do I put it? What do I do with it? I don't want to actively be going out to properties or calling people. There's what's really popular right now is what's called a syndication. And what a syndication is a way that you can kind of gather a bunch of different investors' money together to buy larger properties. And so if there's a apartment building that's for sale, rather than one person needing to come up with, let's say, $2 million, you can gather 10 people. They each put out 200,000 rather than having to go through bank financing. And now you hire a property management company to maintain and manage that portfolio. And then everybody else just sits back and collects a check without needing to actually do all of the work tied to traditional landlords.
I think some of the things that people are afraid of are some of the, greater economic forces that have really been playing a part in affecting property rights. How should people who want to dip their toes into this type of real estate, what do they need to be prepared for? What could alleviate some of those fears?
Yeah, I mean, every state's going to have its own different laws tied with that. I think one of the biggest concerns is always eviction and how do you get tenants out that aren't paying, that have caused damage. And, I think it's just about being educated in what your state requires and what the laws are, because I will say self-help is not legal. You cannot change the locks immediately if your tenant is not paying or your tenant is doing something. You actually have to go through the legal judicial process of filing an eviction. But with that, every state has different time frames on, okay, you have to wait X amount of days and then you file it here, or this had to have happened before you can move forward. So for those people who are wanting to dip their toes, I would say really make sure you're researching your state specific laws when it comes to those things, like eviction, like security deposits, like lease language. And, I think having a attorney or some legal person help kind of get you over the first one is really essential, because those are the advisors that are going to know what's happening on the day-to-day basis with policy changes, not only at the state level, but also the local level, because local governments can really change things. I've seen a lot of changes with those who have short-term rentals. And so, the Airbnbs, the VRBOs have been kind of overtaking a lot of the market and making different entities seem as though they're hotels. And if you're in a mostly residential neighborhood, those neighbors don't want to see the transient movement of people staying on a nightly basis. And so we've seen a lot of local policy really cracking down on that. And so if you're an investor that's looking to get into short-term rentals, you really have to understand what's happening at the local level first before actually taking that step.
Yeah, and particularly considering the Airbnbs and Zillows, like what kind of impact does that have on housing availability and, acquisition of property for just normal people like us?
Yeah, I think there's two edges to that sword. So I'll stick with my market. So my market, we're a college town, right? So we are a traditional transient location. We have people that are coming in typically for a short-term basis. And when I say short-term, I mean students. They're only going to be here for so long. They're only going to kind of stick around and then they're going to move on. The other thing with our particular business market is we are dependent on those students, but also on visitors coming into the university for things usually related to sporting events, other things that are tied there. So if we don't have the accommodations for people to stay, then our businesses are going to suffer, because the businesses can't make money if they don't have the visitors and the support from them. But on the flip side, if you're the local government, you want to have a consistent flow of tax money coming in. And that is going to come from people having full-time jobs in the area and paying their property taxes as local residents. And so you see it on both ends of the spectrum. You want to have people have affordability, but then you also have investors who want to put money into these places that then will also allow the local economy to become stronger. So it's a balancing act. It really is. Now with Zillow is an interesting animal because Zillow's separate from Airbnb. People take Zillow at face value. And so they think that whatever that Zestimate says it is, that's the word of God. That's what the property is worth because Zillow told me the Zestimate was X. Now, what Zillow does is they pull in a bunch of aggregated data and they're just running algorithms in the back, right? Nobody is actually doing more research. So like I live in an area that a lot of times the properties don't go up for sale. And so you don't have recent data. And because market values change as cycles happen, Zillow is only pulling the data that they have available to them. And so it's not actually saying that, okay, this particular area hasn't had a house sold in 2 years. But when it did have a house sold in 2 years, this is what that sold for. So therefore, that's the value of your property. That's a little misnomer. And so as appraisers, you really have to kind of use more art than science when it comes to valuing property that you don't have the comps for. And Zillow is a little bit of like that misnomer. You can't necessarily use that at full face value. It might be a good place to start, but you really have to dive deeper into it.
That is very disappointing. I knew it, but I liked that Zestimate when I looked at it for my house.
Yeah, as long as it's more than what you thought it was worth, it's great.
Well,
but when it's less,
yeah.
it's not so good. So, it really depends on what day they're looking at.
Yeah.
Right.
I actually recently sold my house and we got more for the house than the Zestimate. So all 2 thumbs up there. Yeah.
Love that. I love that. And like I said, again, there's a lot of things that Zillow can't take into account. Like, okay, so my house, I put a lot of work into it. I put a lot of new updates. How does Zillow know that I did all of these things to tell me what the value of my house is? They're just looking at what other people's size, number of bedrooms, and number of bathrooms is. Those are really the only things that Zillow is capable of doing. They're not able to incorporate all of those other, improvements
New roof.
into the value of your property. Yeah. And it's important to know for people who are looking at value, whatever dollar amount you put into your property, it's not ever going to be a one-to-one. So you put on a $16,000 new roof, it doesn't mean that your property value just increased by $16,000. Right? So there are certain aspects though of improvements to a property that are going to give you more value, more bang for your buck than others. So like I had to do a bunch of electrical work. It's not going to add much value, right? It's behind the walls. Nobody sees it. But I redid all of my bathrooms. That's where the value comes in, right? So if you're an appraiser, you're valuing things like that, the aesthetic part is going to add more value than the mechanical, than the, behind the walls type of thing. However, you need the behind the walls type of thing in order to have, a house that's going to sell, a house that's going to be efficient, a house that's not going to cost you a whole bunch of money.
That's unfortunate, but yeah.
It is. I sunk a lot of money into my house and I don't necessarily see the return back for the things I sunk money in.
Yeah.
Thinking of that water heater for $2,000. I'm adding it all up in my head, and it's just not as easily perceivable too.
Right. I mean, new HVAC system, new heating and cooling, new windows. I mean, you name it. I probably have done to this house, and it's not. I maybe will see, like, I would say 10 cents to 20 cents on the dollar of any increased value based on the number of dollars I spent on those improvements.
I would assume, though, that the improvements, like all of those, like water heater or new HVAC and electric, are more appealing to a buyer if you're there comparing two houses, of similar value.
Oh, no, obviously, absolutely.
Yours will be,
You want to also say these improvements will save you on energy costs. And so that's the selling point that you want, because it's like, okay, I put this, energy efficient water heater. We'll just stick with the water heater. And so now your water bills are diminished because it's more efficient, and your gas bill to heat the water is lower because, it turns off and it only starts when you're actually using the hot water. Those sort of things are, they're going to add value, but you're not necessarily going to see as much value out of them.
So I wonder if the advice that you would give to homeowners that live in lower cost of living areas would be different from high cost of living areas. What would someone in Pittsburgh have to deal with versus, Dubuque, Iowa?
I don't know. Pittsburgh is one of the most affordable areas in the country right now to buy in. So it really, they're very much, I would call them pockets. And so in each market, you'll have these pockets where you'll have really, really expensive areas, but then you'll have other pockets that are, the exact opposite. And what I would say is, first off, you have to understand why you want to live in that area, right? You want to understand, is it because you're close to your job? Is it because you're close to your kid's school? Are you choosing it based on a school district? Are you choosing it based off of where your family lives? And so I think it's really important for people to understand the true cost of renting, the true cost of buying, and being able to compare those factors. Because one, when people choose a place to live close to their jobs, I would read a statistic that says, how likely are you to stay in this job for X number of years versus, can you work remotely a couple days a week? And so therefore you're not paying as much in travel costs. Or, you should choose a place to live based off of your personal preferences, and then also off of your budgetary restrictions. And I don't think it matters if it's high or low. It's just got to be a personal choice. It's got to be based off of what your financial, backing is, and, what things are going to mean the most to you. Do you want to be close to gyms? Do you want to be close to parks? Do you want to be close to schools? All these factors are going to implicate whether or not you choose one area over another.
We're definitely in more of a renter's market, or so I've heard on TikTok, in terms of the number of people that are renting and choosing to stay renting rather than buying a home. Do you have any advice for, younger people trying to be home buyers, but obviously with interest rates and things are struggling? Like, what do they need to know, or what other things that should they be considering that they might not be aware of in terms of trying to buy a house instead of renting? Or like, what are the pros and cons? Maybe they should stay renting. I don't know. You tell me.
I think that's an excellent question. And so I would say, if you're thinking about buying, one of two things. Number one, if this is your first time, you can apply for what's called a FHA loan, first time homeowners loan. And so with that, it's a government backed loan, and you only have to come up with 3.5% of the purchase price. And so you don't actively have to save up, the traditional 10 to 20% to actually buy a property. Now you have to be comfortable with knowing that that's going to be out of your pocket. You don't have that now. And then figure out, based off of, if you put 3.5% down, what does that make your monthly payment? And when you buy a house, typically you get bank financing. They're going to put together what's called an escrow account for you. Mm-hmm. And that escrow account is going to accumulate, but basically take 1/12 of your total tax bill for the year and 1/12 of your total insurance bill. And what they'll do is they'll add in both of those 1/12 to your mortgage payment to make your all-in payment to them, what we call PITI, principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. And so you want to understand that amount compared to your rent plus any utilities, and then also a what if rainy day fund, because home ownership isn't something that is always going to be fun. It's not. Like I said, I moved into my house in 2019. And a week after, our boiler exploded. And so we had no HVAC, and it was October. We had no heating. So we had to suck it up and sink 12 grand into a new heating, unit, so that we didn't freeze the pipes. We didn't freeze ourselves. And we had already put 5% down of our property. Most of our savings went to our down payment and our closing, which another thing that people will need to understand is how much closing costs do they also have to bring to the table as the initial outset of getting into the house. And so I would say that's one thing, but that way you're really looking at, if I go with a bank and I go with financing, these are the things I need to understand. Now, we talked about creative financing. Creative financing, you have a little bit more wiggle room, right? You could do a lease option, rent, and have your lease payment being applied towards whatever purchase price you may agree to with the seller. So if you have an older couple that, they've been renting it for years, but they don't want to own it anymore, you could approach them and say, would you be open to a lease option where I'll pay you monthly rent, but that'll go towards the purchase of it eventually, and then maybe even turn it into them being the seller financing, the owner being the bank. Now you don't have to go through the bank. You just continue to make them monthly payments just like you would a mortgage. And then that way you can avoid a lot of other costs that are typically tied with banks, origination fees, appraisal fees, other things that they'll require you to do for closing. So those would be two things I would say if you're looking to own. But before you even go into the ownership, you do want to compare your costs as a renter and your cost as a potential homeowner. Mm-hmm. Now, renters, your toilet clogs, you call the property management company, you call the landlord, they hire the plumber to come, they take care of it. You own the property, you got to figure out where the plumber is, you got to figure out when they're coming, and you got to be the one paying the bill, right? So it's kind of one of those balancing acts. But I will say, for long-term wealth strategy, owning property is always the best case scenario. And what I usually tell my students, if you're a first-time homeowner, if you can find something like a duplex, a triplex, or a quad, something like that, you can still get financing under an FHA loan, pay 3.5% for basically a portfolio of properties. You live in one unit and rent out the other units, and those other units' rents are basically going to cover your entire mortgage payment. And so you're living there, quote unquote, for free, and you're building equity in that property. And all of those rents are now paying down some of your principal payments for the financing. And if you live in that property for 2 years and you wanted to move, you can then take that property out of the FHA loan and refinance it into what's called a conventional mortgage, which is just a normal mortgage. And you can go and reuse that FHA loan again and do it. And that's how you can grow a portfolio of properties that you're actually living in too, and building up equity by, basically living in it and then continuing the process and doing it over and over again.
It seems so easy when you lay it out like that.
I know.
It really does.
Well, finding a property is the hardest part, right? That's
Right.
going to be the hardest part. But once you find something like that, and, even if you put some sweat equity into it, and, if you can figure out that is honestly, if I could tell my 22-year-old self anything, it would be go find a duplex, live in one side, rent out the other. And the nice thing too, under the tax code, if you live in a property 2 out of the past 5 years and then you sell it, you get so much money in free exempt tax money. So for example, let's say I buy a duplex, I've lived in one side and I rented out the other. I've now collected all this rent. I basically was living there for free. I lived there for 2 years. It was my primary residence, but now I just want to sell it. I sell it and I made $100,000 in equity and appreciation that with a traditional investment, you're going to be taxed on what's called capital gains. So money that you made, you're going to pay typically between, let's call it 10 to 17% in capital gains. But if it was your primary residence for 2 out of the past 5 years and you're single, you get an exemption of $250,000 of non-taxable equity. And you can do that as many times as you'd like, as long as you've lived in that for 2 out of the past 5 years.
I'm writing all of this down for my little brother.
And it's all recorded. Just tell him, go back and listen. This is going to be your life lesson.
Yep. Yes, honestly.
You talked about, finding the right duplex. What are some green flags or red flags when you're trying to look at property where it's like, I want to invest here or I don't want to invest here?
Yeah, so one of the things that I typically look for, red flags for me, are the property has been on the market for some time. Maybe they had a pending sale and then it fell through. And then they had another pending sale and it fell through. And you got to wonder, why did those keep falling through? What was happening in probably the inspection that, a potential buyer found that then led them to backing out. Now, it's not always that. Maybe financing fell through and they couldn't get it, through the bank. But you really want to kind of dig deep into understanding what's happening there. You also want to understand the motivation of why the people are trying to sell. Because is it that they've had terrible tenants? Is it that they've had so many problems with the property, or is it that they're just ready to move on? So a lot of those things could either be green flags or red flags depending on the situation. I think that if you can get into a network of investors or people like realtors who are actively getting, people wanting to sell, and if they can send you those properties before they maybe go live to the public, that's a really good strategy so that you can get your eyes on something before maybe there's a huge open house and other people are taking a look at it and it gets out into the word. I would also be telling your network, hey, I'm looking for X. If anybody knows anybody selling X, let me know. Post that on Facebook, post that on LinkedIn, post it on Instagram, talk about it everywhere you go, because you never know who might know somebody who's looking to sell something like that.
Yeah. That's actually how my parents bought their house and how I learned about my house that I just purchased. That's great advice. You talked a little bit about property tax. And your book covers a lot of tax benefits for real estate investors. So what other tax benefits should we know about for investors?
So tax advantages. I love talking about tax. I know this probably is like, well, I love talking about it because I love teaching people how to not pay it legally. Like, there are no reasons why you should have to be paying the government money if you are doing what the tax code tells you to do. And so if you look at the tax code as a book, it's essentially saying, here are some things that the government doesn't do well. And because they don't do this well, they're going to give you benefits if you the private sector do it for them. And so most of those tax benefits come from owning real estate, creating housing, and building and growing businesses and creating jobs. So if you are a business owner, if you own real estate, all of those things are going to give you the best tax incentives no matter what you're looking at. And so owning property, one of the best ones. So you pay property tax on your property. That's a tax deduction. So whatever amount that you paid in property tax for the year, you get to, deduct that from your adjusted gross income. Any sort of improvements, the IRS basically gives us a schedule of what's called a depreciable schedule. And what that means is, what is the useful life of the thing that you added to your property? And we'll give you credit for that over that life cycle. So for example, a roof, I want to say for a residential is probably, I think it's right around 15 years. So let's say you paid $15,000 for a new roof. You're not able to use that whole $15,000 in year one to reduce your income, unfortunately. You only have $1,000 that you can do, but you have $1,000 for 15 years that you can now reduce your income because of the roof you put in. If you have a mortgage and you pay interest on your mortgage under your primary property, all of those interest payments get to be a tax write-off. And so that's usually very specific to you, your personal residence. Now, if you are now investing and you're looking at, I'm creating a investment business, which is what I highly recommend. If you're going to own property, don't own it in your individual name, own it under an LLC or another business asset so that you're reducing your liability. Because if something happens and you get sued, they're not going to be able to touch your personal home, your personal property. They're only going to be able to touch whatever is in that specific business entity. But as an investor, I pay utilities, right? I get to use that as what's called an operating expense. It's a tax deduction. All the taxes that I paid, an immediate tax deduction. So I get to show, I cut my lawn, but I paid somebody to cut my lawn. I have, maintenance company coming in. That cost that I had in that year gets to be reduced entirely because it's now considered an operating expense. Now, there are things called capital improvements, which are things that, like I said, a new roof or something that's going to make your property better, improve it. You're repaving your parking lot, right? You're not going to be doing that probably every single year. It's going to be an investment that you make. And if it's a capital improvement, just like the IRS says, you have to spread that out over whatever the cost of the useful life is. But operating expenses become an immediate deduction if it's an investment opportunity. So that's why owning a duplex, even though you're living there, that's technically an investment. And so while if you were just living there by yourself, I wouldn't be able to deduct the insurance or the utilities and the maintenance. But because it's also a rental, everything gets to be deducted and everything gets to lower my taxable liability. Oh, and I forgot the most important thing, depreciation. Depreciation is your best friend. Depreciation is free money. Basically, what they say is your property as a whole also has a useful life, right? Not just the roof individually, but the property itself. And if you have a residential property, the useful life is 27 and a half years. So for simple math, let's say you buy a house, it's $275,000, okay? You get to deduct $10,000 every single year because that's how much the value of your property has depreciated. In free money.
What skills does someone have to really launch into this? Like beyond being able to read the law code.
Do some math.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, you don't need to read the tax code. You don't need to, read that. You just need to have enough information at your disposal that you are making an informed decision. But I would say that the best thing that people need to understand is definitely creating a pro forma statement. And so really understanding Excel, because that's where you're going to be able to show, is it better for me to rent? Is it better me to buy? And obviously some of the benefits that we talked about with buying have to be pluses, whereas you're not going to get those benefits when you're renting. I have a home office in my house, so I also get the home office deduction for my primary residence. Now, you still get that benefit if you're renting, but just not to the same degree as you would if it was your primary residence that you owned. So there are some tax incentives that you have regardless of if you're renting or you're buying, but by and far away, the tax incentives skyrocket when you own the property versus if you're just renting. But understanding the finances and really being able to compare apples to apples and understanding all of the estimated costs, all of the estimated improvements that are going to happen. That is what I would say by and far is probably the biggest thing that people need to know is understanding the financial obligation in both cases. And what's such a shame in our country and in our system is that we don't see this level of education being taught at the high school level. We don't see even at the college level, because there are not many courses that are covered that are specifically teaching you how to understand a lease. What are the basic principles of that? How does a contract work? If I'm buying a property, what are all the things I need to know? Creating basic financial literacy, creating budgets, understanding month to month what my responsibilities are going to have. And that's one of the things I'm really working to change. I'm really working to provide an educational source, especially for those in high schools, especially for those looking to begin an investing career who don't want to go back to school. They don't have time, and I only have the capacity to teach about 120 kids every semester. So if you're not one of those lucky 120, how are you going to learn about this kind of stuff? And if the other universities, the other colleges aren't offering these types of programs, I still want to get this education out there. I still want people to have access to the knowledge that can help build and grow long-term wealth.
Can I ask what you're doing to get that information? I mean, other than obviously writing your book, but this is mostly for college kids. So what other things are you working on to try and get that information out there?
2 years ago, I created a company called Inspire Wealth. And Inspire stands for investing specifically in real estate. And so the goal behind that was to, create my own portfolio, but then also have an educational component to it. And so what I've been doing is I've been working on online course material that people can take at their own pace. They can learn about different topics. And so I have designed and created these courses that, would be applicable to high schools or people entry level, recent college grads that are looking to get into their first home or looking to buy, or they want to understand landlord tenant law if they want to become an investor. Or maybe I'm a high income earner and I want to know how to reduce my taxable liability by investing in real estate. And I have an entire course based on the tax advantages and how to structure, different ownership opportunities. And so I'm working on that. It's called Inspire Wealth Education. And again, it's something that the general public can join. They can learn about all of it, some of it. And then my plan is to also host live workshops at least twice a year where, I bring in a bunch of leading experts within different areas, other attorneys, CPAs, insurance companies, and people who have that knowledge and that expertise to share with people and help them understand how they can build and grow wealth specifically through real estate investing.
Okay, sign me up. When is it available yet, or are you still working on it?
It's available. I will be adding a lot more content in the future. I also have a podcast where I bring in other people to talk about. So it's the Inspire Wealth podcast. And that's, all that content. I want to be able to provide people with resources and ways that they can better educate themselves, and know that it's not necessarily a YouTube university, because I feel like that's one of the things that, as a actual educator, it's great that people are sharing their knowledge, but a lot of times people take it at face value and they think, well, it was on the internet, it was on YouTube, that's how I learned it. You need to make sure your sources and those that are providing that are actually knowledgeable and actually understand the material that they're presenting.
What resources did you have available to yourself?
None.
None.
And that's exactly why, spending 8 years at Penn State and really seeing that, I mean, these students didn't even know real estate outside of selling houses as an agent. There were opportunities there. And so there was a lot of learning curve. There's a lot of misnomers and a lot of misinformation. And so my first exposure, I mean, my mom and my grandparents had rental properties, and I feel like that's where a lot of people get it. They're like, oh yeah, my mom and dad have a couple properties, and my uncle has a couple properties, my aunt, whatever. But yeah, that might be the case, but what are you going to do? How are you going to build your own portfolio? And they may be able to tell you some things, but you may not want to do exactly what they're doing. And so it's all about, how do you get to that level? And honestly, the first property is going to be the scariest. The first property is where, you're going to learn the most. But if you don't take that step, it's almost like what they say about having kids. If you wait to afford kids, you'll never have them. If you think you'll wait to afford having property, you'll never invest. And so you just kind of have to take that leap. One thing I do encourage people is maybe find partnerships, find other people that you can kind of mitigate some of that risk and mitigate some of those, uncertainties by going in together. And then that way you can use it as a learning opportunity, but not everything is on yourself, right? So as a young person, maybe I would go in and invest with, a friend or another person, maybe a mentor, and have them assist me. And then once I've learned enough that I feel I can go forward, then you go on. But honestly, there's a book out there called The Who, Not the How. And it's all about bringing in other people. And that is how you're going to be able to maximize the most amount of wealth. Don't just go it alone. Find other people that you can bring along with the journey.
And you talked about like getting different people to go in on properties. I know for a while there was some different apps that were really blowing up where people would pitch in. It would be hundreds of people adding to this app, pitching in $100, $1,000. Is that something that you would recommend people look into, or is that a little blockchainy or NFTE, if that makes sense?
So what you're saying is mostly crowdfunding.
Yeah.
And with crowdfunding, you have to be aware of, okay, if I'm putting this money out, what is my interest in the property? What kind of ownership stake do I have? What is the expectation? That probably isn't the route I would necessarily suggest people go through. Now, you just have to figure out, do you want to go through financing, or do you want to go through OPM, other people's money? And you can find people who have a bunch of money who are looking to invest, and maybe you do all of the legwork and they put up the capital, but you still have an equity share in it. And that's a great way of getting into real estate. But you have to be able to figure out who those people are. And I will tell you, they exist. They are out there. I know a ton of people who just have money in a checking account that's not even earning them money. And they're just like, oh, I just don't know where to put it. I don't want to take the risk on the stock market, which that's the other thing is people. There's another reason why I'm creating these courses is because people are dependent on a retirement plan. Typically it's a 401k, some sort of, asset management, maybe mutual funds, but that's all based on the stock market. And so many people who retired, in the 2020 era lost a ton of money on their retirement, and they're not recontributing to that. So they're not seeing any additional money come out. But if they would have invested in real estate, that's still an asset that they have that's still something they control, that they can make money off of, and they can continue to build wealth. And so that's another big reason why I created these courses, is because Social Security is not going to last in our country. People who are dependent on Social Security are going to have to continue working until they're in their 70s, which is a shame. Like, people should not have to spend their entire lives working. But because our system doesn't educate them on all of the opportunities that they have, investing in real estate, investing in businesses, investing in, private money lending, anything like that, they're stuck. They're stuck with a pension that they're making a fixed amount that's never going to grow. And they're now in a higher tax bracket that they're retired, because they're not getting those incentives. They don't have children living at home. They don't get those deductions. They probably, hopefully, paid off their mortgage, so they don't get any interest payment deductions. They may have depreciated their house all the way, so they don't get any additional, and so now you're being taxed at, let's say, a 27% when you were working at 23, and now you're making even less money because you're paying more to the government. But people don't learn this stuff, and this is why we see a lot of generations by generations continuing to stay in the lower middle class, and even the low class, the impoverished level, because we aren't getting access to this information.
I think there are very few people who truly understand the tax code or the tax brackets.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and it is
people.
a tiered bracket, so it's not like everything is taxed at one level. You are taxed, as an incremental growth. But imagine if you didn't have to pay the government anything in taxes. You made investment decisions that now that money isn't coming out of your pocket, it's staying in your pocket. How much more money would you have long term that you can then maybe reinvest in something else that's creating additional cash flow for you? And now your money is working for you instead of you working for your money.
Yeah.
We're talking about the future and perhaps, and more likely, the end of Social Security. What about newer technologies like artificial intelligence, blockchains? How are they impacting the real estate transactions?
No, I think that's a great question, and it's not something that's going away. Blockchain specifically, I think in the upcoming years will completely replace the way that we traditionally finance. Now, the government needs to do a lot more on the regulation piece of it, and really understanding where the money is going, where it's being held, because when we have a lot of international money coming into cryptocurrency, that's where things can get lost in translation, if you will. So I do think that there will be a place that crypto and blockchain will replace what we're doing, or at least be a part of it. When it comes to artificial intelligence, people think I'm crazy. Like, I love ChatGPT. I feel like it's one of my best friends. If you know how to utilize it and you understand the way that it can help you and help make efficiencies, like if you were to go through and you could ask ChatGPT, hey, what would the value of this property be based in this market if these other properties sold for X, Y, and Z and are renting for this? It's going to be able to pull those numbers for you. Now, you want to verify those numbers, but it's going to be able to do a lot of the work for you that traditionally was not readily accessible. So I think it's a great opportunity for people to learn, use, to lean on it. It's going to make business transactions a lot easier. It's going to make efficiencies in marketing a lot easier. But you just have to understand how to use it and implement it.
That's a great. I mean, you're preaching to the choir about ChatGPT for sure. It's made my job much easier.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people, they're scared of it, and they're scared that it's going to replace workers. And I would argue to say it's going to replace inefficiency. It's not going to replace the human aspect, but it's going to replace the things that we spend a lot of time and a lot of energy doing that aren't necessarily adding value. Right. So it's those kind of things that we can really lean in on it to make our lives and our jobs simpler. But understanding that it's still a computer, it's still a robot. You want to make sure that what it's telling you is it makes sense and that you are verifying, that information.
Yeah. And just like other industries where new technology has come out, it hasn't necessarily replaced a job. It's really just changed the job a little bit. Instead of sitting down and writing something for marketing, I can ask it to start, and then I have some, it's just changed. And now I'm more of an editor rather than writing for certain activities. But
I mean, if you would have said 5 years ago, we were going to record a podcast and we were going to be in 2 different states and we were going to make it all happen, we probably would have questioned that. And I think, it's crazy how much technology has changed and how much we have to be able to lean in on that change and not be afraid of the change.
Well, we have one more question before we let you go. Do you want me to do my spiel? Okay. This is a little segment that we do at the end of all of our episodes called You're Wrong. Not necessarily you, but maybe Michelle and I, maybe our listeners. And this is your time to set the record straight regarding some misconception in your field.
I would say when people they ask me about, what I do and that I teach real estate, they assume I'm teaching agents and they assume that I'm teaching those that are, selling property. And so you're wrong. I don't do that. Actually the opposite. I teach everybody else how you can actually be an investor, how you can actually build wealth yourself. So I think it's a wrong misconception that if you're in real estate, the only thing you can be in real estate is by being an agent. That is wrong. Every single person in this country can be in real estate and should be in real estate because it's an asset we're all going to need. It's not going away. We're all going to need a place to live. It might be on the moon someday, but you know what? That's still real estate. And we still need to have facilities that host and hold for businesses and, all these other different things. So it's not going away. It's always going to be there. And in order to build and grow wealth, one of the best strategies is investing and understanding how to get there and finding the right education sources to make that, happen. If there are listeners out there from other universities that are thinking about incorporating this type of coursework, I would love to talk with them. I would love to kind of give them some feedback on how I teach and a little bit more detail about the book and the material included in the book, because I do plan on continuing to update that, getting other professors, worksheets and access to my course materials, my PowerPoints, and all of the things that I use in the classroom on a daily basis. So I would happily talk to them. Also, I would love to talk with anybody who is thinking about implementing maybe an online version of this or would like to explore my courses that I've created on my own through Inspire Wealth, high schools, charter schools, or even the individual investor who's looking at ways that they can build and grow wealth. Check out Inspire Wealth Education. I would love to, help bring my passion to everybody else and help them grow a portfolio that is long lasting.
Thank you so much. It has been really enlightening for me as well. We appreciate you taking the time to explain some of these things to us who just aren't as familiar with this side of real estate, even though we should be as homeowners.
Yeah, definitely.
It's okay. I come across it every day, so I get it. I understand.
Thank you, Mallory, for joining us on today's episode. Unless you seek out information about real estate, tax benefits, and investment, you may never learn about how to take advantage of the economic opportunities and increase your wealth. In a world where there is uncertainty about our economic future, real estate is still a safe investment. And as Mallory said, the first acquisition is scary, but take the leap. Thanks for tuning in to Can I Get a Retake, a podcast by Great River Learning. If you liked the episode, show your support by subscribing, sharing, and leaving a review on your favorite podcast platform. For detailed show notes and transcripts, visit greatriverlearning.com.
Can I Get a Retake is brought to you by hosts Michaela Albee and Michelle Manneman, with editing by Maggie Christensen. Artwork for the podcast is crafted by myself, and our intro music is courtesy of Comma Media. We'll be back soon with another captivating chat with a top GRL innovator.